What I'd like to share with you today is some of the research that I was privileged to be a part of when I first started working at the Clayton Christensen Institute for Disruptive Innovation. And one of the things about education and technology when they come together is that people will look at some novel things and they will want to use the term disruptive innovation because they think that somehow we are seeing something that disrupts the norm, that disrupts the status quo, and so they want to use that term and say, oh, that must be disruption happening. And so what happened was we had to do a lot of work around sort of educating people around what a disruptive innovation is. And I'm only going to just touch the surface about this theory just because it does have quite a bit of nuance to it. And so if you want to learn more, I'll point you to the right resources. But I just wanted to touch upon what this theory is. And so really what it comes down to is a disruptive innovation helps us explain why it's so difficult for organizations to sustain success. And what happens is that in most companies and most organizations, what happens is that managers would try to build what we call sustaining innovations. These are innovations that help us produce better products and services for our best customers. And what disruption is about is it's a countervailing set of innovations. And instead, what you have is really sort of an innovation that sort of starts at the bottom of the market and slowly is able to gain traction and improve over time to displace established competitors in the field. And the way that a disruptive innovation is able to do this is that it brings to the market something that used to be very complicated and expensive and makes it suddenly accessible and affordable to a whole new population of people who we call non-consumers. And non-consumers are the people for whom there was really previously no other alternative. Their alternative was really nothing at all. And so if we think about this in terms of higher education, what do we count as a non-consumer of higher education? And they include what we in the US would call a non-traditional student. This is 71% of the US college-going student population would qualify as a quote-unquote non-traditional student. These are people who commute. They work part-time or full-time. They have families. They have jobs that get in the way of their pursuing a degree. And so these are folks who don't necessarily have the luxury of majoring in a field that doesn't necessarily have direct relevance to their future goals and direct economic relevance. Who else are these non-consumers? These, according to the National Center for Education Statistics, we can imagine that in 2020, over 40% of college students will be over the age of 25. So not your typical 18 to 22-year-old student. UCLA had a really interesting survey where 87.9% of college freshmen identify that getting a better job is one of the vital reasons why they are pursuing a college degree. And that inflated, that was up about 17 points just from a few years prior to that study that was done. McKinsey has some really interesting statistics where their analysts estimate that within less than a 3-year period, the number of skill sets required in the workforce went from 178 to 924. So if we think again of the emerging demands of our knowledge economy, things are just compounding in a way where we need more than maybe just the 4 years of education that are sort of front-loaded in what we typify as a college experience. We also have approximately in the US about 91 million Americans who have high school and or some college who could benefit from earning some sort of credential. And this includes alternative credentials, not necessarily always a 2- and 4-year degree. So the challenge is that the context around higher education has changed so dramatically. A college diploma doesn't necessarily give you access into the middle class anymore. It doesn't sort of just boost you and give you that sort of social mobility that we once used to attribute to a bachelor's degree. And then tuition costs continue to soar, and more of that financial burden of pursuing a degree is really passed along to students and their families. At the same time, we have this kind of perfect storm where students' priorities are changing. There are a growing number of students who are finding themselves what we call overserved by the traditional bundled augmented services that traditional institutions tend to provide. And these are students who might be looking for briefer, more targeted and affordable lifelong learning experiences with flexible pacing. Some might already have degrees, and some may be struggling to transition within or into the workforce, and they may be observing firsthand the immediacy of economic uncertainty. And so as a result, these students are becoming what we call savvier shoppers of higher education, and they're looking for what we would call a different job to be done. So the premise of what we call the jobs to be done is very simple. Customers don't just buy products or services, they hire them to do a job in their lives. So as the great marketing professor Theodore Levitt once taught, the customer doesn't want a quarter-inch drill, he wants a quarter-inch hole. So there are multiple products and services that you can hire to do that job for you. And what this simple concept highlights for us is how traditional institutions have really historically performed numerous jobs for all sorts of peoples, and therefore may be susceptible to the same kinds of disruptive forces that newspapers encountered. So briefly, if you think about what we used to hire newspapers to do in our lives. We used to hire a newspaper to keep us abreast of global and regional news and help us with a broader conceptual understanding of the world. We used to hire newspapers to keep us, to help us find real estate. We used to hire newspapers to help us find a mate. We used to hire newspapers to keep us from getting bored, right? We used to do the crossword puzzles and do Sudoku or read the comic strips. We hired them for these multiple and varied jobs. But many of our newspapers have been unbundled piece by piece, job by job, by organizations like Google, CNN.com, Monsters.com, Craigslist, LinkedIn, blogs, and many other things. And so if we translate into this concept into higher education, today, most of our colleges are trying to be everything to everyone. In the US, we have close to 4,700 four-year degree granting institutions that are all relatively expensive and also undifferentiated from one another. And we may need to think about college in a different way in terms of the job that we hire a small liberal arts college to do perhaps should be different than what we hire a state flagship to do in our lives, or a Harvard or a Princeton to do in our lives, or a community college to do in our lives. We have to better understand why are students hiring higher education in their lives, or what is the real job to be done when it comes to delivering higher education. Today, the major skills gap in the US has created what we call a new job to be done for students that centers on learning to do, not just learning to know, but learning to do. Employers have really become a lot more vocal about their dissatisfaction with the unpreparedness of job candidates. There's a really oft-cited Gallup poll where 96% of chief academic officers in the US believe that they are preparing their students adequately for the workforce, whereas only 11% of business leaders agree. So that kind of disjunction is something that is emerging more and more and is also being brought to the attention of policymakers. And at the same time that employers are getting more vocal about their dissatisfaction, they're also retreating from offering as much training as they used to. And as a result, students are realizing that they need to hire some sort of cost-effective, more streamlined program to help them get ahead in their working lives. And more graduate school or more college is not necessarily the answer, as a lot of these programs, as a lot of institutions, traditional institutions, don't even offer these kinds of specializations that are emerging in our knowledge economy. If you go back again to this idea of those 924 skill sets that might be required, we are not equipped in traditional institutions to deliver necessarily all of that kind of training. And so what Clay and I published in 2014 was sort of a response to the craze around massive open online courses in 2013. Everyone kind of kept coming to us and asking us, are MOOCs disruptive? And we kept trying to say, no, that's actually missing some really important markers when it comes to disruptive innovation. But we really want you to pay attention instead to this thing that's kind of flying under the radar called online CBE. That's aligned to workforce needs. And so we wrote this book called Higher Education. And the idea is that the disruptive potential that we saw was in this fascinating combination of things that were not new, but the combination of these things was something novel and something to sort of take note of. Competency-based education, as most of you know, has been around. Mastery-based education has been around for a very long time. Online technology for about four decades. Online technology sort of started just getting good enough when even places like the University of Phoenix first tried to launch their fully private online private universities. That's as early as 1989. And then workforce training has been around for a long time. But the combination of all of these things together was what we wanted to pay attention to. And so when we think about what was transformative, the way we currently measure learning, right, is based on seat time, credit hours, measuring the amount of time your butt sits in a seat. And what we have is fixed time and variable learning. What we wanted to point out that was more interesting is that mastery-based learning really made that learning fixed and time variable and pace flexible. And so what's important is that in competency-based learning, students advance upon demonstrated mastery. And these competencies include explicit, measurable, transferable learning objectives that really empower students. And then assessment is a more meaningful part of the process because you actually are doing assessments of and for students. There aren't these high-stakes assessments that you can necessarily fail. And then students are also, through the use of online technologies, are able to receive more rapid and differentiated feedback on their learning needs and progress. And all of these competencies are meant to include how we understand how students are able to apply and create knowledge as they learn. The reason why we wanted to focus on online competency-based education as opposed to pure offline is because when you actually move and use online technologies as a technological enabler, you can actually modularize learning in a way that hasn't been possible before. So again, thinking about how we would move towards those 924 skill sets, it's impossible to think of us finding some sort of new and emerging field that we need to sort of suddenly be able to tailor a program for. It's difficult for us to take one day of learning from a specific syllabus in anthropology and take another day of learning from biology and put them together and have them make sense. But when you actually break down learning into competencies, you're doing something different. You are transforming learning into can-do statements. So we can talk about how students can use disparate pieces of information and build a research-based argument. A student can present or persuade effectively. You don't necessarily need to have specific content in order to achieve that competency. You could do that through nursing, through an MBA program. You could do it through using your current work experience to explain how you have achieved and attained that kind of mastery. And as a result, when you modularize in this way, you can actually stack in a much more cost-effective way and a much more scalable and flexible manner. And if we think about what our employers are demanding of potential candidates, you can actually backwards design programs. You can take, if an employer says, I want people to be able to do design thinking, we can actually take that and build backwards and understand what are the competencies that students need to have and then move backwards and design. There's a lot of mischaracterizations of competency-based education. It gets conflated with a lot of terms like prior learning assessments or vocational training. But I just wanted to sort of show you an example of what we do at a place like College for America at Southern New Hampshire University. These are the 9 different kinds of competency clusters that you can encounter as a student. These are not what we would call vocational technical training, right? This is not career technical education. These are things that we talk about when we talk about liberal arts competencies. And these are embedded in these kinds of new online CBE providers. Northern Arizona University has an entire degree called their online competency-based degree in the liberal arts. And what they do is they describe it as teaching people how to fish. So if students are learning a programming language, even though they might be learning a specific programming language at the moment, they're teaching them how to fish for information and evaluate the resources out there so that once that programming language may go defunct, that they might be able to pursue another one and learn how to teach themselves. The idea is that it kind of comes back to what John Dewey was writing about in 1915, that nothing can be more absurd than trying to educate individuals with an eye to toward only one line of activity, right? When we think about helping people move into the workforce, people tend to get very concerned that we're training people for a single job. But as you can see, this kind of new learning experience affords us to understand that it's not simply about one skill set. Right? We're trying to imbue these different kinds of competencies that may help students learn how to learn for a lifetime. There are now, even if you may not necessarily be on the CBE bandwagon, there are now a whole set of organizations that are homing in on these untapped connections between learning and work. So higher education institutions are now going to be, they're now going to start competing with organizations they've never heard of. And these are all getting at inadequacies of the system. And as hard as it is to imagine now, students are going to begin to pick and choose their learning from different providers. It's already happening. Even when Ben Nelson, the former CEO of Snapfish, decided to create the Minerva Project, which was meant to build an Ivy League experience at half the cost, an elite Ivy League experience at half the cost, everyone said, well, there's no way that someone who's even thinking about going to Princeton or Harvard might go into the Minerva Project. The beginning cohort of the Minerva Project, over half of their students had already been at one of those elite experiences and decided to opt out because they were not getting what they were hoping to get out of their educations. Students are going to become savvier because there are more and more alternative learning providers that are emerging, that are giving students real experiential learning. Coding boot camps are on the rise. In 2014, we only had about 5,000 students attending boot camps. Last year, we had over 16,000. These coding boot camps are boasting job attainment rates that are anywhere between 65 and 99%. That's better than if you were in the US and you decided to go to law school. According to the American Bar Association, your chances of getting a job after law school are only 57%. So, as much as traditional schools might characterize these kinds of offerings, and edX has started to move into this, they're doing their X series, Coursera is starting to build their specializations that are tailored to the workforce, and Udacity, which everyone first kind of called a failure when they started moving into vocational training, this is when they decided, no, I'm going to try to create a pipeline directly that helps students get into companies like Twitter, Facebook, and Google. So traditional institutions may have a tendency to kind of characterize these as not good enough, right? Or it's something that doesn't even compete with what it is that I offer at my campus. But these new potentially disruptive providers can compete on a completely different set of metrics that have no relevance to what we do now in traditional education, but are performing a more dynamic job to be done for all of those non-consumers of higher education. And they are building those more direct pathways from education to employment. And I'm not trying to argue that workforce training is and should be the be-all, end-all of higher education, but it's just to say that the context of higher education is changing so dramatically. And so I just want to end with this idea of the Chivas Regal effect in higher education. So Chivas Regal, the Scotch. When parents and families and students are offered two different options of pursuing an education, one that is lower cost and one that has the higher premium, what is it that they choose when they're trying to decide which is a quality education? They will inevitably pick the higher priced option because they believe that that is a proxy for quality. And this is what we call the Chivas-Regal effect in higher education. And whenever I go around and kind of talk about disruptive innovation, people kind of get it, and they say at the end, yeah, but places like Harvard and Yale, they're not going to ever be disrupted, right? They're just going to, they're safe. They're buffered from all of this, right? In 2014, MIT developed a 200-page Future of MIT Education Task Force report, where they imagined their own disruption and what they needed to do in order to brace for that disruption. They could see that students would come to them having taken maybe 2 years' worth of massive open online courses for free. They may have done their gen ed requirements all at a community college. They were looking maybe for a very specific kind of makerspace or tutorial learning experience that they would not be able to find anywhere else. Even the folks at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology are thinking about this and wondering what it is that they need to build in order to cater to those savvier shoppers of higher education. So this is just to sort of plant the seed that as much as certain brands may seem to be safe and secure now, the things that sort of appear marginal and like blips on the radar that we kind of don't understand, like some of these alternative learning providers, these are the things that we really need to pay attention to, because they get at this idea of starting in the bottom of the market, getting better over time to get to the point where this is actually a viable opportunity that competes with the established competitors in the field. And all institutions of higher education are really going to have to think critically about whether or not they adapt their curricula to these changing times and how they attend to these non-consumers of higher education who might be, thinking about these different opportunities that exist. So as we move forward, I hope that what you will all be able to do is think about what is the job to be done for our students. Thank you.